I'm joined today by my colleague Shannon Quinn Sheeran, also with Housing Innovations. Hi, Shannon. And Housing Innovations, I think we probably have a mix of folks on the webinar today who are old hats, have been around this block more than once, as well as some people who may be brand new to our Connecticut Balance of State COC team. And so just for people that don't know, Housing Innovations is the firm that Shannon and I work for, and we are the consultants to the Connecticut Balance of State Continuum of Care. So we basically are the support team for the Continuum of Care, and we also lead monitoring both for the Balance of State Continuum Care as well as for DMHAS. We monitor on behalf of DMHAS statewide their COC, Continuum of Care rental assistance projects. So before we jump in, I'm just going to do a couple of housekeeping things. We did have quite a large RSVP pool for today's webinar, and so we had to change some of our usual Zoom settings so that everyone that wanted to be here today could be here today. And what happens when we do that is that it changes some of what you guys and what we are accustomed to in these meetings. So I think that you may not have the ability to unmute yourselves. So there are two ways you can ask us questions today. One is to put your question in the chat box. Shannon and I will monitor the chat box during the course of the presentation and ask out loud any questions people put in that chat box. I also think that you can raise your hand and we'll try to also monitor to see who has their hands up. And then we can, I think, invite you to speak if you're once we see that your hand is up. But if that doesn't work seamlessly, which it may not, just please feel free to put your question in the chat box. So, so a couple other quick housekeeping things.
Look, Alice just joined us, Mark.
Hi, Alice. How are you?
Good. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Sorry, I'm a few seconds late.
No worries. I was just doing housekeeping stuff, Alice. So the other thing is that I don't think we usually like everybody to be on camera because it's so nice to be able in these COVID times to be able to see you all. But because of the unusual Zoom settings here, I don't think you guys are able to turn on your camera unless you're a panelist. So sorry about that. And then Shannon, if she hasn't already, is going to get the slides up into the chat box in just a minute. The slides for today will also be posted to the CT Boss website. We are also recording the webinar today. So if anyone on your team isn't able to make it and is interested in the content, that should be up on our website within a few days. So we are scheduled until 2:30 for 90 minutes. We definitely won't go over. We got a lot to cover, so we'll probably need the full 90 minutes. And if we don't get to all of your questions, I will stay on and answer any remaining questions after 2:30. So Alice, is there anything you wanted to say by way of introduction before we jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone. I don't know, I'm sure Lauren or Shannon, you did mention that this monitoring is really specific to the HUD work that we do, and not necessarily it's not the same monitoring that CSH has done for us in the past and will do for us in the future, but you know, similar things may be looked at. So but I just wanted to say that there is the monitoring part on the services end that will still continue through our work with CSH.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks, Alice. So this is our agenda for today. As Alice just said, we are going to be talking about continuum of care monitoring, so not path monitoring and not the quality improvement that that CSH does with DMHAS. We're going to talk about just what monitoring is and what our goals for monitoring are. We're going to talk about what you can expect when we come out and monitor, because like I said, some of you are new and have never been through this before, although looking at our list of attendees, I can also see quite a number of you who have been through this before. We'll talk about what the changes are to the monitoring guide for 2022, and you'll be happy to know that there are very few changes in 2022. The guide looks very, very, very similar to what you've seen in the past. And we'll talk about what are some common findings that we see when we monitor, and what are some steps that you all can take to avoid those common findings. We'll also talk about what to expect if you get a notice from HUD that says that they are going to come out and monitor. And then we'll point you to some additional resources that are on our website. And then finally, and really throughout, like I said, anytime you have a question, please put it in the chat box. We also really love to hear from you guys about any suggestions you have for how we can make monitoring more helpful to you guys, but also more efficient. We know that you guys are super busy, and we want to take up as little of your time as possible with the monitoring activities, and are always open to suggestions. And the contact information for Shannon and I is the last slide in today's presentation. Today is not a full like soup to nuts compliance training, right? There's just no way to do that in 90 minutes. We wouldn't do that to you guys, try to do a full soup to nuts compliance training on Zoom. So we're going to cover some, compliance it's sort of a compliance light training today, in addition to talking about the nuts and bolts of the monitoring process. So before I jump in, we just really want to take a minute to acknowledge the extraordinary burdens that you guys and your teams have been under since the beginning of the pandemic. And just remind everybody to take a breath, to, always, but particularly in these really difficult times, give yourself some grace, give each other grace, right? We absolutely get that. In this environment, crossing every T and dotting every I on the compliance front is absolutely not your top priority, nor should it be, right? So you guys are working super hard every day to get people housed as quickly as you can and to keep them housed. And that really is the most important thing that we can all be doing to help people stay safe and healthy during the pandemic. So we get it. We know that this is monitoring is always a challenge. Compliance is always a challenge, and particularly now during the pandemic. And we are absolutely want to do everything we can to be flexible for you guys in terms of scheduling, right? So if you get a notice from us that says, proposes a date that we're going to come out, or even if you've already scheduled a date and it just can't work. I mean, we understand, particularly now during Omicron, you guys are facing unprecedented staff absences. So just reach out to us and we will do everything we can in terms of scheduling flexibility or whatever else you guys need to make monitoring work during the pandemic, and always, really. So, all right. So just to start, in case folks are really new and not sure, wanted to talk really quickly about what monitoring is and why we do it. So basically, monitoring is an assessment of how closely your written materials, your policies, as well as your practice and your documentation of that practice aligns with what your funders' expectations are, right? So when we monitor, we look primarily at what HUD requires of COC programs, but we also look at what CT BOSS requires and what DMHAS and DOH require of their subgrantees. And the reason that we do that is to be helpful to you guys primarily, right? That's the goal, is to help you guys understand all of the copious requirements and align your practice as best you can to those requirements. We also do it because HUD requires us to do it, right? So it's part of one of the responsibilities of the COCs that's outlined in the COC program interim rule, is that we monitor projects every year. And then similarly, HUD also requires, so many of you do not have a grant directly with HUD, you've got a sub-award. So either DMHAS or DOH is the recipient of the HUD funds. They're the ones that have the grant agreement amendment directly with HUD, and you guys are sub-recipients on those awards. And so HUD also requires that both DMHAS and DOH and any other recipients of COC funds monitor their subrecipients. So that's another reason why we do this. And we are slated to monitor between the DMHAS COC rental assistance projects and the CT BOSS projects. We're slated to monitor 12 projects in 2022. So we've got around 100 projects in the balance of state. And so we're only we don't monitor every project every year, you'll be glad to know. So we're monitoring 12 projects this year. We also every year monitor usually most years, we monitor one project on behalf of DMHAS that's in our other COC in the state, the Fairfield County COC. Okay. So these are all of the different, throughout the slides today, you're going to see this green text that's underlined. These are hyperlinks. So if you open the PDF and you click on those hyperlinks, it should take you directly to all of these materials on the HUD website. And it's a lot, right? So the requirements for the COC program are complicated and they are spread across many different documents. And so that's part of why we do this, part of why we monitor, is to try and consolidate everything for you guys in one place so it's not so hard for you guys to understand what HUD expects from your programs. So these are links to all of the different federal requirements that your programs are responsible for. And then these are the links to the local requirements. So HUD also requires that COCs adopt certain local policies and that recipients adopt certain policies for their subrecipients. So these are links here to all of the different local requirements that your projects are responsible for. So it's a lot, right? And we know that you guys are, every day doing this tremendous juggling act. And like I said earlier, the compliance, as it should not be, is not always your highest priority. So our goal really is to support you guys and make it easier to understand what all of these core requirements are, and to help you to follow the rules without having to dig through literally thousands of pages of regulations and HUD notices. So we try to do our best to filter through all of that information, and when we come out and monitor, really help you guys to prioritize and make informed decisions about risk management, right? Because there's some kinds of ways that you could be not in compliant with the rules that are less risky, and then some ways where you could be not in compliant with the rules that are more risky, that HUD's going to come in and say, hey, you know what, you weren't following the rules, you have to give some portion of the money that we gave you back. And we never want to see that happen. But we also get that it's probably not possible for you to be 100% in compliance every day at every moment, particularly given the kinds of staff turnover that you guys are seeing. So we really try to help you guys to understand, okay, here are the most important things that you want to work, that, we suggest you're going to want to work on fixing first. And we're always available, not just when we come out, and when I say come out, we don't come out anymore during the pandemic, but meet with you virtually on Zoom. We're always available, not just during those Zoom meetings, but anytime. Pick up the phone, call me, call Shannon, call Howard, who's our third team member that does Connecticut monitoring with us, and we'll answer whatever questions that you have. So these are just some of the things that we commonly see when we come out. We are continuously super impressed by your teams. Your folks have been out there since the beginning of the pandemic, continuing to provide services for people, continuing to get folks housed and to keep them housed, and making it happen despite the pandemic. And then on top of that, we also see that not only are you, doing the work for your clients to get them housed and connected to the services that they need, but you're also continuously strengthening your alignment on the compliance side. So we always see, we almost always see progress if we come out multiple times to visit a project. We almost always see progress since the last time we came out towards, getting more and more in compliance with all of the requirements. So that is incredible. Kudos to you guys. I don't know how you do it, but you do, and it's quite impressive. So, this is what we're trying to accomplish when we come out. Again, we want to make sure that we are helping you guys to understand the rules. And we really want to make sure, like, if you think about when our team at Housing Innovations comes to monitor you, it really is a test run. Our goal is so that when HUD comes out and monitors, you get a clean monitoring report, right? You don't have any findings. So that's always our goal. And so we really do a pretty comprehensive, detailed review because we don't know what HUD does not, we'll talk more about this later. HUD doesn't look at everything when they come out and monitor, but you don't know until you get the notice what they're going to look at. So when we come out, we really try to do a full spectrum review, not just of the HUD requirements, but also of the state, the local requirements, again, to give you guys kind of a full heads up about every place where you might have a compliance risk. And ultimately, the goal is to make sure that all the money that we get to house homeless people in the state of Connecticut stays in the state of Connecticut, and we can use it to house homeless people, and that we don't have to send any of that money back. And then the monitoring is also just super helpful to the COC for us to be able to see, okay, what places are people really got it, no problems, we don't have to spend a lot of time developing guidance or tools or trainings, and then where is there a deeper need for additional training and TA. So ultimately, at the end of the day, though the primary goal is for monitoring to really be a technical assistance for you guys, to be helpful to you guys, there's also, the steering committee is the steward of these public funds. So the steering committee does have an obligation to make sure that the funds are being spent in accordance with what the funds are intended for. So it is possible, right, that if we came out and monitored and you were wildly out of compliance, and then we came back again and you were still wildly out of compliance, and there wasn't any progress really on resolving those issues, right? You were serving people who were completely not part of the target population that was intended, or you were spending money in ways that were completely not the intent of what the program is for. It's possible that the steering committee could make a decision based upon those kinds of very significant findings to what we call reallocate the funds, which would basically mean to discontinue the funding for the project and to reprogram that money towards a use that's more consistent with how the money is intended to be used. But that's really, that's an absolute last resort. We really have been very successful at not having to do that. Because as I said before, you guys are largely in compliance, and when you're not, make progress towards getting in compliance. So like I said before, we can't monitor every project every year. We have to decide which projects we're going to monitor every year. And so these selection criteria are not new. These are the same criteria that we used last year. We do tend to prioritize larger grants, but just because you have a small grant doesn't mean you're never going to get monitored. You will still get selected for monitoring at some point, even if you have a very small grant. The reason for prioritizing larger grants is because the more money is in the grant, the more of a recapture risk it is, right? So, but we also prioritize agencies that are new to the COC, or agencies that are running a new kind of project, right? So maybe they've been in the COC for a long time, but they used to do permanent supportive housing, and now they're doing rapid rehousing, right? So that would be a reason why, but one of the factors that we look at when we decide what programs to select every year. If we come out and you've got a lot of significant findings, it's likely that we'll come out again the next year just to make sure you're on the right track and headed in the right direction towards correcting those things. If you get a lower score on your, so we, as do all COCs, we evaluate performance of renewal projects every year. And if you score poorly on that renewal evaluation, you're more likely to get selected for monitoring. If you don't spend all your money, and not all your money, but you don't spend the vast majority of your money, you're more likely to get selected for monitoring. If we get a complaint for someone, and you guys rock, right? So this happens very infrequently, but every once in a blue moon, we get a complaint from a consumer or a CAN partner or the HUD field office. I think that only ever happened once, asks us to look into something. That would be a reason why you might get selected for monitoring. We always make a commitment to you guys that whenever possible, you don't get both a COC monitoring and a quality improvement review in the same year. There are times, like some extenuating circumstances, where it does happen that we have to review the same agency in the same year, but we really try hard to coordinate with CSH so that doesn't happen. All right. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Shannon now. And just a reminder, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or raise your hand, and we'll see if we can figure out how to unmute you so you can ask your question.
Yeah, a couple of people have put questions in the Q&A, but it's easier for us to monitor one thing, to be honest with you. So if you just put them in the chat, that would be helpful. And somebody asked if the slides, how they will get the slides. So again, I drop them in the chat at the beginning, and after I'm done talking and then Lauren speaks again, I'll put them in the chat again, because if you weren't here, then I don't think you can see them. So I'll put them there again. And then at the end of the day today, by the end of the day today, the slides will be on the CTBOS website on the training page. So and then we'll also put the video recording up there. Okay, I'll put them in the chat again. I see that somebody said they can't see them there. Towards the end. Okay. What to expect during monitoring? Next slide. So just to walk you through the process, there's a little bit of a process. You're going to the next slide, right? Yeah, okay. There's a bit of a process before monitoring and then the day of. So we are, until further notice, we are doing remote monitoring, and we had started doing this before COVID was a thing at all. And it was well received. People, providers gave us feedback that it seemed to be less disruptive for them, less interruption within their mode of doing business throughout the week. So we intended to continue, and now this is how it's going to be until further notice. So remote is different because we access all of your records remotely. We used to do some policies and stuff remotely beforehand, but now it's everything. It's client chart and everything. For client chart, for everything, we limit what we want to review to the most critical items for remote. And in particular, we look for new requirements always. If there were areas that you had previous findings the most recent year that we did monitoring, we're going to want to look at those things as well. We send you all a list of documents you want to see for specific clients, for client charts, a few days in advance, 2-3 business days usually. And to ensure that remote monitoring is somewhat less burdensome, we try to keep the list on the brief side. So what you do with those, the client records, is you upload unredacted documents into the client's HMIS files. This way, HMIS already follows HIPAA. They're already a secure website. We don't have to worry about missing some, blacking out someone's date of birth, a child's name. Inevitably, there were things missed when redaction had to happen. So we don't have to worry about that in HMIS. And then in turn, you all give us at Housing Innovations remote access to, or if you have an electronic record system that's not HMIS, you could give us access to that. But either way, you have to either give us access to your HMIS or your own electronic record system for a few days so we can look at the client records. We've used the HMIS option the last couple of years and it works fairly well. And again, our goal is to make this as painless as possible for you. So if you all have any suggestions what we can do, let us know. Alice, did you have something you wanted to add? No? No, okay. The monitoring guide. Lauren and Housing Innovations put this together. So that is, again, easier for you. She listed out all those federal documents. So this is an attempt to put everything in one place, or the most important things in one place, make it easier for you all to understand what the rules are and how to follow the rules. So please take advantage of like looking at this, even if you're not being monitored, because it really contains a wealth of information, not just the monitoring items 1, 2, 3, but then everything that's cited in there, all the regulations that each item comes from, and then tools also that you all can use to make things easier, like a template for a policy, or a template for writing goals, or a service assessment, that type of thing. So please look at that document and use it, because it does contain tons of good information. Next slide. Elements of monitoring. So these elements of monitoring have not changed. What can you expect when we come out this year? The approach is the same. You send, we look at some policies in advance. We look at documents from your participant charts during the visit. The day of the visit is when we look at those. We notify you at least 4 weeks prior to a visit, and usually it's more like 6 to 8 weeks. And we meet for an hour-ish at 9 a.m. at the beginning of each visit. In between our beginning of the day and end of the day visit, we talk to a case manager, we talk to a client, do those interviews. If you're a nonprofit and getting either a direct award from HUD or are a subrecipient getting COC funds through DMHAS or DOH, we do a fiscal review. In between entrance and exit, we also, in addition to those interviews, we review participant charts. We meet with you all, your staff, at the end of each visit to tell you what we found. You say if you think we missed something, and we can retake a look at that, or if we made a mistake. Afterwards, after that day, we write a draft report. You take a look at that and send us back comments. Same idea if you think we got something wrong, missed something. And then once you get those comments back to us, we send you a final report, and you would submit a plan to us outlining how you will address the findings. We send you a template for that also. Next slide. Zengen, excuse me, was new. We used it in 2021 for the first time with monitoring, and that was how you all submitted your documents ahead of time. So it's a grants management database for CT-BOSS. The rules haven't changed on that either. The BOSS providers must enroll in Zengen to be able to submit necessary documents. So by now, I believe you are all enrolled. We do send reminders on a quarterly basis to look at your project, your submission profile, your contact profile, so that you always are giving us the most current information on who is best to contact regarding what grant in your organization. So it's your responsibility, the agency's provider's responsibility, to keep all of that information up to date. Just a reminder for that, and you do get regular emails on that. And then through the document submission portal, you all submit documents ahead of time. there are directions and more information linked here on the slide about how to use Zengen, how to get a profile, how to update information, how to submit documents. If you do have any issues with any of it, after you've looked at the instructions and everything, please contact me.
Shannon, I just wanted to say really quickly, because I think we probably have some ODFC folks on the line. So this is only relevant for CT-BOSS projects. So if you are an ODFC provider, you'll upload documents to Dropbox and we'll send you the link. And then if you can neither upload documents to Dropbox nor use Zengen, we'll figure it out with you. So no worries, you can just submit to us by email if that's the case for you. I know sometimes our state staff are not able, their system blocks the use of Dropbox.
Thanks, Lauren. Also, I think I maybe, when I posted the slides, I didn't post them to everybody. So again, I'll remedy that after I get off after I mute myself. Written policies and administrative requirements. So just a reminder for you all that if you've submitted these in the past and we've had no issues with them whatsoever, you don't have to submit them again. We only want to see that policies that you have changed or policies that you want us to consider to address previous findings. So, for example, if on your 2021 report, there was no finding on the policy on educational rights and services, and you haven't changed your policy, you don't have to send that again. If there was a finding on that in 2021 or the most recent time we monitored you, and you don't submit anything new, we're going to carry the finding forward in the 2022 report. So if you did update the policy to address the finding, please submit it to us. Next slide. This is a copy of the report key. This is what that looks like. So findings are kind of have a different hierarchy. So the green is best practices, yellow is a significant area of non-compliance, and pink is the most serious. That's a significant area. And submission of a follow-up plan is required. For the other two, for yellow and green, there is no follow-up plan required. However, I will say if something's been an issue for you and it's yellow and there have been 2-3 times we've monitored and then there's been no movement on that issue, we might ask you to submit a follow-up plan on that issue. We most likely will. Next slide. Changes. So does anyone want to sing along with me? I always want to sing when I do that. So as Lauren said earlier, there are very few changes for this year. But some of the changes I think are kind of exciting on a system-wide level. I don't know if you all share my excitement about that, but we'll get to those. So new in 2022, the rapid rehousing rental payment standards have changed. So because this is new and very detailed, I'm going to talk through it. Months 1 to 2, security and first month's rent are covered at 100%. Months 2 to 6, tenants pay 30% of their net income towards rent. Month 7 to program exit, tenants pay 60% of net income towards rent. And rental assistance terminates once 60% of the net income is equal to the rent. So this does not apply to YHDP, and coming soon there is going to be a tool for you all, an updated rental or rapid rehousing rent calculation tool. So that'll all be able to be auto calculated for you all. Next slide. So new for this year is also in this past fall of 2021, CT-BOSS passed a new LGBTQIA+ policy. And then in a few slides on, we're going to talk about race equity and consumer involvement. And these are the things I was talking about. that I think are exciting on a systems level, because it's really looking at, and this all has been coming for a while, right? And it's us all catching up with the times. But it's really looking at, for LGBTQIA plus and for race equity, the questions we want to ask ourselves are what are our own internal biases, right? For some of us, these very ingrained, learned from when you were a child, ideas and beliefs about this is the way things are. And now those things are we're finding those things are different, changing, maybe never were that way in the first place. So it really does, for some of us, challenge some core beliefs. But we need to look at those things and those ideas and how they impact the work that we're doing, and how do we then ensure that everybody who's coming to us for services and everybody who participates in our organization, right? This is agency and organization level stuff, feels welcome, is treated fairly and equitably, and has the same opportunities as anyone else who comes through the door. So how do we look at this from an interpersonal level? If I'm a case manager, how do I interact with my clients in an equitable way? And how do I interact with staff and coworkers in an equitable way? It's an agency level. How do we give everybody the same opportunities? And then it's a systems level, and that's what this policy tries to point to, all of those levels. So for this policy in particular, some specific items that we want to think about are using participants' chosen titles, chosen names, chosen pronouns. It's okay to say to people, what pronouns do you use? It's okay to say, what name do you go by? And sometimes if the pronouns don't match what we're seeing in front of us, or the pronouns don't match what's on their driver's license, that's okay. It's respecting who the person identifies as themselves and treating them in a respectful manner to how they identify. It's prohibiting this policy also prohibits disclosure of information. You're not going to talk to other clients about what's going on with this one client in terms of their gender or sexual identity. And it's about documenting any incidents that have to do with these kinds of issues and connecting clients with gender affirming healthcare providers. Next slide.
Shannon, there are a few questions in the chat box. There are a couple that are related to rapid rehousing. So we'll finish out this topic, and then we'll go back to the rapid rehousing slide. But there's one that relates to this topic, so I'll ask that one now. And it is, how is this different from a non-discrimination policy? Is this covered in that, or does it have to be a new policy? So Diane, I think if your non-discrimination policy already covers gender identity, not in sexual orientation, and all of the elements that Shannon is going to go through are already incorporated into your agency's policies and procedures, then there's no reason that you have to have a separate LGBTQI non-discrimination policy. So it really is going to depend upon, we often see non-discrimination policies that are aligned to the federal requirements, which don't necessarily haven't historically necessarily included gender identity and or sexual orientation. So you want to make sure that your policy includes those things, and then there's no reason to have it that you necessarily need to have a separate policy.
Thanks. Next slide. So to continue with the LGBTQIA, some more items that might be specific to the housing programs are making single access restrooms available for people of all genders. And then you may have gender specific programs, activities, facilities. And if there's a person that does not exclusively identify with a specific gender or identifies as gender fluid, then they get to choose. That individual gets to choose what or where is the best fit for them, and whatever factors they want to use in that decision-making process is okay. We just have to respect what they want and allow them to go where they feel the safest and most comfortable. And then in terms of dress code, dress codes must equally apply to all genders. So for instance, if a dress code has a stipulation about skirt length, we're not going to say women's skirts. If it has a stipulation regarding to the length of somebody's shorts, we're not going to say men's shorts. We're just going to say if someone's wearing a skirt, it must be to the knee or whatever. That's what my kids' rule is at school. Just not make it gender specific about the wardrobe. Next slide. So treat these policies as any other anti-discrimination policies. Establish an agency-wide policy, and as Lauren said, what you have already may cover what we've talked about here. If it doesn't, you may want to add a few sentences so it does cover what we talked about here, or look at the LGBTQIA policy that was posted, that was linked in the first slide, 2 slides ago when we talked about this. Look at it on the CTBOS website on the policies page and see what looks relevant for you to add to your policies. But as with other anti-discrimination, make sure it's displayed in your agency. And we did do a training on this, an equal access training. So the slides are available here and the video is available here on the CTBOS website. They're on the CTBOS website as well. Next slide.
Okay, I'm gonna actually go back before we move on to the
yeah.
topic and answer the rapid rehousing. I'll do my best to answer the rapid rehousing questions. So Rebecca, I'm sorry, I saw you had your hand up, but I didn't see it until Shannon had already moved on to the LGBTQIA, but I see you put your question in the chat box here. And the question is, what if you have, this relates to the change in the rapid rehousing assistance levels. So what if you have a client in month 5 and we have been charging the 60%, do we go back down to the 30%? I think Lee from DOH is on the call. So I'm not sure if anyone else from DOH is on the call on the webinar. If I get this wrong, please jump in, folks from DOH. I think it's intended as new people come in, right? You're going to start using the new assistance levels. So you wouldn't necessarily, if you were already working with somebody, go back and change things up. Although maybe in certain circumstances you could, if that was what was necessary. And what I would say is on a case-by-case basis, if you have specific questions about specific cases, just talk to the team over at DOH to make sure that what you're doing makes sense to them. And then the second policy is the second question is, what month does the new rapid rehousing policy start? And the policy was approved a few months ago by the steering committee, and the calculation tool, as Shannon said, has not been released yet. So I think probably a lot of folks haven't yet started to do the calculations according to the new assistance levels, because they're waiting for that tool to be available. Lee, if there's a specific start date that you guys have, can you put that in the chat? Or I think
she unmuted herself here.
Okay, great.
Yep. Hey, Lauren, thank you for that. So yes, so we approved the policy, but knowing that there was some work to be done after that policy was approved. And so DOH has been working closely with Housing Innovations to develop that tool to get it out to the rapid rehousing providers. So I would say until that tool is released, to continue kind of what you've been doing in terms of the rapid rehousing calculations.
Great, thanks, Lee.
Thank you.
All right, go ahead, Shannon.
All right, race equity. There's a new section in the monitoring guide about race equity and consumer involvement. So what we have on these the next few slides is options that you can check off, have taken or not taken in the past 12 months. And this this is in the same vein as the LGBTQIA policy. With good reason, there's been greater and greater focus on both race equity and bringing the voices of people with lived experience of homelessness more on board on every level of COC programming, from the individual program level up to the system-wide level. Governance, people's agency boards, all of that type of thing. So these slides outline the opportunities on the guide to improve these areas, and for you all to really, again, take a deeper dive and look at what's going on in each and every one of your programs. And again, it's another area where I would encourage you, even if you're not being monitored, to look at this and for an opportunity to improve and treat everybody with more equity. So here are some examples of ways to promote race equity and consumer engagement. Involve people with lived experience and those identified as Black and Indigenous or Indigenous people of color, BIPOC, and LGBTQIA staff in staff and on board positions. So take a look at the people who come to your organization for services. Look at the demographic makeup of those people, what races, what ethnicities, what languages are spoken, and how does the demographic makeup of your staff, including the board, compare? What can you do to make that more equitable? Create an inclusive organizational culture for staff and for consumers. Do people identifying as BIPOC, people with lived experience of homelessness, LGBTQIA+ folks feel welcome? Do they feel included? For staff, do these groups have the same equal opportunity for advancement as other people? In terms of engagement, there are many ways that we can include people with lived experience of homelessness. Do you have a consumer work group? Look at consumer surveys, which are a requirement anyway. So what actions are taken from the input that we get from that? And how, if we do take actions, how is that reported out to the consumers, out to the people who are involved in our program, so that they know that their voices are making a difference and their voices matter? Do you have opportunities in your program to give suggestions and input? Is that a formalized process? And then again, do you report back on what's been done for those suggestions that people give you? Next slide. Additional opportunities to increase race equity. What organizations do you partner with? What populations do they represent? Look at your program to determine if there appears to be any bias for or against any certain type of population in the outcomes of who gets what. Like for all of your people who end up exiting to permanent housing, what is their makeup? Is it biased more towards males versus females, Black, white, multi-race? Look at all of that information that you can either find in your own HMIS, or I think on the next slide, there's a link to on one, or the CTCAN data, which is broken out by those areas, and see if there are disparaging outcomes, disparate outcomes, where some people get better opportunities than others. And if you find something there, then what can you do to address those findings? For agencies that have not taken any of the actions that are listed on the guide in the past 12 months, to at least have checked or haven't checked at least 3 of those items, you're going to be asked to briefly describe specific actions your agency is going to take in the next 3 months and include target dates for that. Next slide. So yeah, this is the resource slide that I was talking about. So there's a race, and these are very, very good, thoughtful resources for you all. It's just so you don't have to start from scratch if you're just trying to address this for one of the first times in an official, planful way in your agency. So the race equity impact assessment tool can be used to minimize unanticipated adverse consequences in a variety of contexts, including the analysis of proposed policies, institutional practices, programs, plans, budgetary decisions. The tool linked offers some example questions that you could use when you're putting into force this type of an assessment. CTCAN data again is linked here, and that you can filter by race, ethnicity, and gender, so that can be helpful in looking at some of your outcomes. Restorative justice practices and housing programs. This restorative justice originated as an approach to reducing harm that was caused by criminal behavior. So by allowing victims to be heard and offenders to understand their impact, restorative justice focuses more on repairing the harm rather than just punishing offenders. And responding to criminal behavior or programmatic rule violations with criminal justice interventions and or program exclusions has greater negative consequences for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Restorative practices can help to address racial disparities. So that tool is very helpful as well. A race equity framework to advance equitable access to housing resources and services. So that's a group that has come together to already look at what we do as a system and make recommendations. And it's another excellent resource for our whole system, and then how our own agencies can impact that system. Next slide. Avoiding common monitoring findings. Next slide. I like this visual. Internal chart review, avoid surprises. So some tips that you can do. So some tips you can use to get ready for monitoring: ensure supervisors review all eligibility documentation. That's a common place where, and it's a more serious finding when it does exist, because it can lead to, what's the word? It can lead to HUD asking for money back. Recovery. I don't know. There's a word for it.
Recapture.
Recapture. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in real quick, Shannon.
Yeah.
This is really very, very important, not only on the HUD monitoring, but as many of you know, we've talked about this for years now. We've had the state auditors in, and they are looking at everything. If numbers, HMIS numbers are off, if the documentation doesn't support the person being in the program, it can be very problematic. So I just want to really check and make sure that everything is 100% correct on the documentation. Thanks, Shannon.
Thanks, Alice.
I'll just say one thing also, Shannon. So the thing about a HUD finding on an ineligible participant is that you've got for programs that are older, you've got participants who have been in the program for 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, right? And when HUD has an ineligibility finding, they can recapture all the money that was ever expended on that participant back to when the participant originally entered the program. So it's a big recapture risk, because it's not just for this year. It's when if you don't have documentation that the person's eligible, it can go back, the recapture can go back for years and years, which really adds up to quite a bit of money.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to remind you all that it is the responsibility of the program staff to look at all eligibility documentation as you're taking clients into your program. It's not, we often get documents from the CAN, but when we're coming to monitor you, we're saying, okay, did you look at these documents and did they meet the HUD requirements? And if they don't, then it's between you and the CAN and the client, you have to work to remedy that and get all the documents necessary. It's a good idea to conduct an internal chart audit at least annually. And then use electronic health record to identify missing, overdue documents, gaps, or electronic health record, or HMIS. Another thought about eligibility documentation, that eligibility must be valid as of the date of project entry. Oftentimes there's some type of a gap, like this is done in preparation for somebody to be entering housing. So they'll do it a couple months in advance of project entry and say, yes, this person is still homeless, they're in this shelter or whatever the case may be, but it's as of a date that's maybe a month or 2 months prior to the person entering. So it has to be they're homeless upon entry. So just look at those dates and make any changes needed. Next slide.
So I just wanted to say there was a question in the chat that Alice answered, but I think it's important for everyone to hear it. So I'm going to say it out loud. Thank you, Alice, for answering it in the chat. The question is, would eligibility documentation mean homeless verifications, disability verifications, et cetera? So that's exactly right. So what we mean when we say eligibility documentation is that for all of our programs, that they've got the required homelessness that is necessary for the kind of program that they're entering. And then for PSH, they also have to have the disability. Those are the two main ones. There's a little bit of a few other things depending on the kind of program, but those are the two main things.
Thanks. Next slide. More on documentation requirements. So there's a tool, and the next couple of slides will show some screenshots of the tool that was created that lists all of these things, all of these requirements by program type. And the goal is to use this tool throughout the year so that you're always ready for monitoring, rather than using it when you get the notice and kind of scrambling at the last minute or in the last month or whatever the case may be to make things right. It really does make things easier if you have kind of standardized checks throughout the year, once or twice a year. So yeah, the participant chart documentation, it lists out by PSH, by rapid rehousing, transitional housing, YHDP, what is required for each type of program. There are links to required forms and sample forms in the document. And just a reminder that it says at the bottom to retain all documents for a minimum of 5 years. So participant eligibility documentation, keep that for 5 years after the end date of the last grant operating year, during which the participant was in the program.
So an easy way, because that gets confusing, an easy way to just think about that is keep the eligibility documentation for at least 7 years, and then they're going to be safe.
Perfect, thank you.
Lauren, I just want to jump in. We asked that the eligibility documentation be retained for forever. Because again, the auditors come back and look at it, and whether the person is, depending on the time that they look at the documentation, that is something they want to see, is that were they eligible for the program based on the eligibility that was in place at the time the person moved in. So we do ask that people keep their eligibility.
I realized as you started talking, Alice, that I probably should have been more specific. It would be, so the federal requirement is that you keep the eligibility document 7 years after when you discharge the person, right? So are you talking about you keep eligibility documentation forever for everyone, regardless of how long ago they were discharged?
No, yes. So we have a 7-year requirement as well. And then
Okay.
After a person's been discharged, and then we do have agencies have their own policies. So as long as it meets the DMHAS standard of 7 years, they can, they have to keep it for us for 7 as well.
Okay, so I'm going to say what I think it is, and then you tell me if I'm wrong, Alice. So for people that are currently enrolled in the project, you're going to always have that documentation forever, as long as they're still enrolled, even if they got enrolled 20 years ago, right? Correct. For
Yep.
people who you've discharged, you've got to hang on to that eligibility documentation for at least 7 years.
Correct.
right? Okay, that's aligned with, that's the same for the feds.
Okay, perfect.
All right, next slide. And this is just a screenshot of the document that I was just referring to. So you can see the document type and then whether it's required for each type of project, PSH, rapid rehousing, including bonus and YHDP, TH, including YHDP crisis housing, and then YHDP youth navigator. So you can see, as Lauren said, as we referred to earlier, documentation of homelessness is consistently required for throughout. Disability required only for PSH, and then age would be specific to the YHDP project. Next slide. Non-YHDP CT-BOSS homeless requirements. So just a note about Dedicated Plus, all projects starting January 1st of last year, all PSH projects within CT-BOSS became Dedicated Plus. That's just a new change from last year. I was going to talk about eligibility requirements, but I think we've done that. Category 1 is literally homeless, shelter, transitional housing, or a place not meant for human habitation. Category 4 is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, human trafficking, and does not have another option for where they can live at the moment. So those are the categories listed out there. Next slide.
So, and I just want to say quickly, so if anybody's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, these categories, what, because I'm brand new to all of this, there are trainings that cover all of these different categories and what they mean and what the documentation requirements are for all of these on the CT-BOSS website, and we'll link to them, show you where those links are later.
Okay, BOSS YHDP homeless requirements, just because YHDP is very specific and has a couple of different things on them. So again, HUD categories of homelessness that Lauren was referring to. Category 1, literally homeless. Category 2, which really doesn't come into play in any other type of program for CT-BOSS. Category 2 is at imminent risk within the next 14 days of homelessness and does not have another option for where they can stay. And then category 4, again, is the same as the last slide, fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, human trafficking, and does not have another option. So just make sure in your documentation, and I think some of the tools that we have created includes this, that it says does not have another option when that's relevant to the category that the person fits into. Eligibility verification. So yes, these are the tools that have been created for you all. They're posted on the CT-BOSS website and they're linked here for you. Just a note on the sample project intake policy, and there might be another policy item or two. If and when you do use this, there are places to fill in the blanks with your own agency's information. And we have received some policies where it's like, insert agency name here, and nobody's done that. It's just still insert agency name here. So please do that. Insert the name of your project where it's required if you use those policies. Next slide. Rent reasonableness. So this is another area that people sometimes find challenging. You have to, so make sure that your recipients, your sub-recipients, they have written policies and procedures for documenting comparable rents, determining rent reasonableness, documenting rent reasonableness in case files. And when you look at this slide, this first check mark, units assisted with rental assistance funds can exceed FMR. If you can verify with documentation of comparable units being priced that it's normal for in your area for your units to be priced above FMR, and if it fits within your project budget, and projects using rental assistance funds are allowed to exceed FMR. So just to back up a minute, rent reasonableness must be proved for all of your units, and we do that. There's a form linked here that can be used by finding 3 comparable units to the one that you're proposing to get. So we want to find units in the same neighborhood. We want to find units that are similar in size. So look at the square footage for the places you're getting your comparable spot from, and it's just got to be similar. Not at the exact same, but similar. And look at the bedroom size, as similar as possible is what we're looking for. So utilities included, utilities not included. Look at those things to get your comparables and to prove rent reasonableness. Document 3, and then note that second bullet. Yeah, that's, and the rent for the assisted units must not be higher than the comparables. That's another thing that we've seen from time to time, that you'll list as a comparable and the rent will be less than what you're proposing to pay for the client's unit, and that can't be the case. Right, next slide. Termination of assistance, again, must be consistent with Housing First. There's a Housing First training linked here. But the idea is that we provide housing without any preconditions. We don't require sobriety. We don't require compliance with any mental or behavioral or physical health treatment for that matter. We just don't find excuses to try to terminate people. We look at that for when we look at that in the records for when clients are terminated, and then we look at that for in your documentation as well. We look at all your regulations for your program and make sure that there's not anything that would go against Housing First. And then for termination, written notice of that is important. And this is confusing for people sometimes because programs will say to us, well, it was a mutual thing. People were moving on to a better place. They got a Section 8 voucher. They got a placement here. They were happy. We were happy. Everyone was happy. And that's not the point of this written notice of termination. It's just to be clear about like that, so that we're all on the same page, so that there's no misunderstanding. And on the written notice of termination, you notify the participant of opportunity to appeal their decision. You tell them they have a right to receive written notification of the final decision. There's a reason for terminated listing. And then we send that notice to the last known address if we don't know the current address of the person, to the last known address, because there could be the case where somebody says they're leaving. We're understanding that and we're making plans to discharge them, and we understood incorrectly or they changed their minds. So that just keeps everything clear, the written notice of termination. The only reason we would not send a written notice of termination is if the client is deceased. Next slide. I think, do I turn it over to you, Lauren, now?
A little bit and talk about how to avoid some of the common findings that that Howard, who does our fiscal reviews on our housing innovation team, some of the common things that he sees when he does those fiscal reviews. And as we said earlier, monitoring will include a fiscal review if you are a nonprofit who is receiving either directly from HUD or as a subrecipient any COC funds. You can expect your monitoring to include a fiscal review.
Sorry.
Yep.
I'm sorry, Alice wanted to address before you launch into that.
Yeah, before we switch gears to the financial piece, the eligibility piece, I wanted to also just remind folks, I know we get or you guys get CAN referral forms, and on the CAN referral forms, there's boxes that say like there's no more chronically, I'm paraphrasing, there's no more chronically homeless people on the by name list, or, this person has been deemed dedicated plus and is the next eligible person. Those boxes really need to be checked off. Again, when we have the state auditors coming in, they're looking to ensure that people are meeting the eligibility requirements and that people are being served in the timeliest fashion possible and meeting the HUD regulations. So they really do want to see that, and I hate this term, but no one's like jumping the list, that there really are no more people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, and the person that is being housed next is meeting the target population and is meeting the dedicated plus criteria. So I just want to reiterate that, like, we know we have a lot of documents, we know it's a lot to do, we know some of the documentation you receive it from other parties, but really check through when you're receiving documentation from other parties and ensure that it's completed correctly. And, work with them if there is missing data elements, work with them if there's incongruent data elements, but, we really need to have everything line up correctly and properly.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say, so when I said before that, crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's is, not necessarily going to always be possible. Eligibility documentation is not the place to say this is impossible, right? Like, eligibility documentation is a high priority. And so if you've got a finding on eligibility documentation, that really should be a central focus of your efforts to correct, because it is so important, as Alice is pointing out, not just for HUD, but also for the state audits, which those state audits tend to be a lot more detail oriented than what we see. So, just because you had a glowing HUD monitoring where there were 0 findings, don't expect the same thing on a state audit. Those state auditors really are looking through things with a very fine-tooth comb.
And they come back year after year until there's a number of years with no findings. So, we've come a really long way. You guys have come a really long way, but until there's like 0 problems, they will continue to visit with us every year. So they literally have taken residency in our building and on our floor, because the amount of funding that DMHAS receives from HUD and the potential for the recapture is so huge. So thank you for letting me interject that.
Of course, Alice. All right, we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to go through the next set of slides pretty quickly. But like I said, if you've still got questions at the end, just stay on and I'll answer all your questions. So one of the common findings that we see, and is also a significant finding that you really want to try to avoid or fix when there is ineligible costs. So when you think about what is allowed, like how are you allowed to spend this money, there are 2 things that you have to think about. One is the cost eligible? And then 2 is the cost approved, right? So in terms of eligible costs, all of your projects have, every year, you do a grant application, a project application, and then you get a grant agreement. And in that grant agreement are the eligible budget line items for your grant, right? So you can only spend money on budget line items that you have been approved to spend money on your grant, right? So for most of the CT BOSS programs, that's going to be rental assistance, supportive services, and project admin. Then we've also got a smattering of projects that have leasing, operating, or HMIS. So you can't, so for example, if you are a rental assistance program, even though repairs in a unit is an eligible COC operating cost, you don't have an operating line in your project, so you cannot spend money on repairing a unit because you're a rental assistance project and you don't have that operating budget line item. So it's really important for you to know what budget line items are in your grant. And then it's also important to know what does HUD consider eligible on each of those budget line items. And that's defined in the COC program interim rule. So, and at the bottom of this slide, you can see a training that Howard had done previously that really goes through all of the budget line items that you might have, what are eligible costs, and commonly found that we see ineligible costs on each of those budget line items. So if you are a case manager, you probably don't need to worry about this. But if you're somebody on the webinar today that's responsible for making sure that the money is getting spent on eligible items, and you've not already, you do want to probably take a look at that fiscal components training to make sure that you guys are only expending COC items on eligible and approved costs. All right. Really super common finding we also see is some confusion between what's project admin and what is an indirect expense. So project admin is an actual budget line item in your budget, right? So that's the line people I think probably often think of it as the 7% line, because that's what CT-BOSS caps this line at 7% of your total grant. And that project admin line can only be spent on very specific things, right? So it outlines in the interim rule what those things are. I'm going to show you a link to a training in a minute that goes into much more detail than I'm going to go into now, but you can spend that money on things like your environmental review, on things like monitoring, on things like renewal evaluation and your APR, right? It's different than indirect. So indirect are like the things that your agency, your general agency overhead expenses, right? They're not direct expenses. They're not things that you're necessarily spending specifically for that project. It's general agency overhead. So that's things like your agency payroll costs, your agency payroll, meaning like the administration of the payroll, right? Your agency human resources costs, right? Your agency IT costs. Those are direct, generally, usually indirect expenses. And so what's different between these two things is not only what's eligible, but also how they have to get billed. So admin costs have to be billed as a direct cost, which means you need backup documentation for that cost, right? You can't say for an admin expense, it's not billed as a percentage of your overall budget. So you can't just say, oh, we've got 7% admin, we're going to bill 7% every month. You've actually got to have backup documentation for all of those expenses. So if you've got, and we'll talk in a minute about how you do that, but if you've got time, staff time on doing your APR, or doing compliance related activities, or your environmental review that are eligible admin costs, you have to back up to show that that's what those staff were doing in the hours that you're billing. That's unlike indirect, right? Indirect, you can bill as a percentage of your total budget, right? So if you've got, there are two kinds of indirect rates. You can have a NICRA or a negotiated indirect rate. And if you've got a NICRA, you bill it as a percent of whatever your NICRA rate is, or for agencies that don't have a NICRA, you can have what's called a 10% de minimis indirect rate. And it's a little bit more complicated than that. You've got to be mindful of this thing called modified total direct cost, which I'm not going to get into today. So if you are if you are either billing a NICRA rate or especially a de minimis rate, you do want to make sure that you look at the training that Howard did specifically on this topic recently. Like I think he did it in August. And that's linked to here, both the slides and the webinar recording. If you are not claiming an indirect rate, so every year in the project application, agencies have the ability to say, yes, we want to claim an indirect rate. Most agencies in CT-BOSS are not claiming an indirect rate, and it's something that you might want to consider doing. You're not going to get any more money, right? But it does allow you to bill within the money that you have certain things that you may not be able to bill without that indirect rate. And Shannon put the links to that training in the chat box as well. So, and if you ever have questions, because it's very complicated, this finance stuff. So if you ever have questions, feel free to reach out. And if we can't answer your questions, we will connect you with Howard, who certainly can. So another place where we commonly see issues is that if you've got staff in your program that are either working on more than one project or on more than one budget line item. So for example, if you've got a case manager that's delivering services and also doing housing quality inspections, or also doing, maps for environmental reviews, right? Those are the different budget line items, right? So they're spending time on the rental assistance line item, they're spending time on the supportive services line item, and they're spending time, if they're doing environmental review stuff, on the admin line item. It's not enough just to have a timesheet. HUD wants to see documentation of the time spent specifically on that project and on each budget line item. So one way that you can do that is through this thing that HUD calls a personnel activity log. And there's a sample personnel activity log linked on this slide. Some agencies have good enough case notes or other kinds of logs, records that they keep within their agency, that they're confident that if HUD came out and did a monitoring, they'd be able to generate the records needed out of those other systems. So the personnel activity log is not the only way to do that, but it's one fairly straightforward way that you could do that. And again, if you have questions about that after you've looked at the tool, feel free to let us know. Okay, so we're going to talk about HUD monitoring. The good news about HUD monitoring is that it really is a take-home test. Right, so you get to know what the questions are before they show up to monitor your program. So linked on this slide is what's called the HUD monitoring exhibits. So those are the documents that the field office staff are actually going to be using when they come out to monitor your program. So in some cases, the monitoring staff will literally just read what it says on the exhibits and ask you those questions. So if you've not already, and you get a HUD monitoring notice, it's a really good idea to look at those exhibits because you're going to know what they're going to be asking and looking for. The other great thing about HUD monitoring is they don't monitor every single area typically, right? So when they come in, they're going to send you a letter. They're going to say, we're going to review, these, whatever, 3 areas. The number changes a little bit, but I've never seen one where they say they're going to review every area, right? So we're going to review match documentation, we're going to review financial management, and we're going to review cost allowability, right? So then you can go back to this link and look up what are the questions in each of those areas in these monitoring exhibits, and you're going to know exactly what they're going to look for. So we do commonly, when they monitor, they do usually monitor program participant eligibility documentation. So another reason why making sure that your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted in that area is super important. Okay, so we're almost at the end of our time, and I'm just going to go through and show you some places where you can get more information. So first, coming up on the 23rd of March, Shannon and Liz from the HI team are going to be leading this introduction to the CT BOSS COC training. So for folks that are new and sort of unsure of the basics of all of the acronyms and how the COC functions, and that's a really good place for new staff to get oriented and get linked in. So we definitely encourage you guys, anybody that's new to the COC, to attend that. We also, I referred earlier to these other CT BOSS compliance trainings that are really kind of more soup to nuts than we were able to do today at the bottom of this slide. So this is where you're going to find more information on eligibility documentation, what are each of those HUD categories mean, and what types of documentation do you need to have in the participant files for each of those HUD categories. These are some resources both on the CT Boss page and the CCEH page for our youth homelessness demonstration program projects, our YHDP projects. These are the statewide rapid rehousing model guidelines with the changes that Shannon highlighted earlier that were adopted back in September, that, as Lee said, will be rolled out soon with the new rent calculation tool that we're working on with DOH. We also, DOH is in I think the final stages of doing review of a new tool for rapid rehousing, an operations guide that goes really into a lot of detail about all of the different requirements for our rapid rehousing program. So we also hope to roll that out in the next couple months, and we will do a webinar when we roll that out just on rapid rehousing requirements. And then also here, CCEH maintains the repository, the statewide repository for all of the required rapid rehousing forms. So that is linked on this slide as well. A couple years ago, we worked with DMHAS to do an operations guide for COC rental assistance. And so that guide, as well as the webinar that we did when we released that guide, are linked to on this slide. So if you are a DMHAS COC rental assistance program and you haven't reviewed those materials, you want to do that. And then we at Housing Innovations maintain the forms repository for the DMHAS COC rental assistance program. So all the forms and tools and resources that are available for those projects are on the CT Boss website, and there's a link here on this slide. And then that's it. So I said earlier on that we really want to hear any suggestions that you guys have. You know, we are going to be, we had in the last couple of years really been focused on COVID related resources, and then our compliance trainings really focused on new things that were coming online, right? Like, so we did the operations, the COC operations guide. We did, you know, dedicated plus. We've not done kind of, you know, standing requirements in a while. We are hoping this year in 2022 to get some webinars out and recorded and up on the website. So if there are particular priorities on compliance topics that you have, please let us know. You can put them in the chat box or call Shannon or I. And then again, if you've got suggestions for how we can make monitoring more helpful to you or more efficient for you, please let us know that now, or call us, email us with those suggestions. So, and then this is our contact information. So we'll stay on if anybody has questions, comments, suggestions, but that's the end of our content today. So feel free to hop off if you'd like. We appreciate your time. We appreciate all the work that you've done. And we hope that you and your teams and your families and your clients stay safe and healthy. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Someone's asking me to reload the chat. I will, but also I'll let you all know that it's going to be on our website on the trainings page later today.
Okay, Shannon will put that in the chat again now for anyone that wants to stay on to see it. I also see a question in the chat. When will agencies be notified of monitoring? So we notify people of monitoring on a rolling basis usually. So at least 4 weeks before, and it's almost always 6 to 8 weeks before monitoring. So some agencies have been notified already that they've been selected for monitoring, and then agencies additional agencies will get notified. We try to complete all the monitoring by May, so that we can finish it before the end, including the report before the end of the planning grant term, which is June 30th. So all of the monitoring notifications will go out at the latest April, but probably most of them will be out in March. All right, looks like Shannon got the slides up in the chat again for anybody that wants them.
Mhm. Yep.
Just gonna stick around